Hi folks, again, video 2. So we're going to look at the first stage, the 3-stage process for cellular respiration. So we're going to look at glycolysis. Okay, so the first thing to think about when we talk about glycolysis is exactly what the word means. Okay, so when we look here, let's split it down. So glyco means glucose. Okay, and lysis means to split. Sometimes we talk about cell lyse, a cell lyse or goes through lysis, which basically means the cell is burst, okay, it splits open. So what we're talking about is we're talking about taking glucose molecules, okay, and splitting them up. So if you can imagine, this wee dude here will have millions of glucose molecules inside it. So you think on Christmas Day you could probably have smashed about 10 of them in a row, okay? So all of those glucose molecules that you're going to consume, your body is going to break every single individual glucose molecule down into its basic components, okay? So first thing to think of is glucose is a type of sugar, which therefore means it's a carbohydrate. I don't know if I'm even spelling right today or not. Okay, so carbohydrate. So we have, the carbohydrate is made up of carbon, hydrogen, and 8 means with oxygen. Okay, so essentially what's going to happen during cellular respiration is we're going to use this entire glucose molecule and everything it's made up of, okay? So when we talk about glycolysis, so glycolysis is when a glucose molecule is broken down to form what we call as pyruvate. It's a 3-carbon molecule, or you might, if you, depending on what you're reading, what textbooks, what papers you're accessing, it could be classed as pyruvic acid as well. All right, so a quick diagram to kind of explain how do we go from a glucose molecule to pyruvate. So first of all, we have our glucose molecule, okay, which I'm going to say has 6 carbons. And remember, you don't necessarily need to remember the carbons to answer questions from the SQA, but it helps you understand why sometimes, especially when we start talking about citric acid cycle, why all of a sudden we can have carbon dioxide there. So we're showing you what essentially is happening to these carbons as such, the journey of the carbons. Okay, so glycolysis is split into 2 stages or 2 phases. Okay, so the first phase, okay, is classed as the energy investment phase. Or stage, whatever you want to call it. Okay, and essentially what's happening is, because we're starting a process, so remember when we were looking at our ATP and how we said that the ATP is this important molecule that gives energy. So it gives energy to almost all biological processes. So at the minute, to break this glucose molecule down, we require energy. So what we're going to do is we're going to invest, okay, we're going to give 2 ATP molecules, okay? So those 2 ATP molecules, the end phosphate group is going to, so the bond between the second and third phosphate groups going to break, which is going to provide energy for us to convert this glucose molecule into another type of molecule, i.e. compound, okay? So because we're removing, the bond is breaking, we're removing the end phosphate, we therefore create 2 ATP molecules, okay? So because we've started breaking this molecule down, we no longer have a glucose molecule. I remember we spoke previously about there's different pathways, so you can have alternative pathways, you can have reversible pathways. What's essentially happening here, and as we've said before in class, you know, this is quite a complex part of the pathway. If you go to university, you'll learn that there's lots more to this. We are teaching you the kind of basics of what you are expected to know from the SQA. However, there's many different ways and many different pathways this can take. So this intermediate compound can take many forms, many forms. Okay, and we class it as an intermediate compound to remind you that it's no longer glucose, but it's no longer our end product either. Because essentially, when you think about it, that this is our substrate, and an enzyme is going to come along during this process to basically break down to give us our end product. Okay, so our intermediate compound, and then what's going to happen is, and this is where we start introducing different types of enzymes as well. So we've went from glucose to our intermediate compound during our energy investment phase. We now go into our energy payoff phase. So what that means is we are paying back the energy that was invested at the very beginning. So between the intermediate compound and the next point, okay, there is 4 ATP produced. Okay, so this is where phosphorylation occurs. So remember, phosphorylation is the addition of a phosphate group. Okay, so what's happened is at the energy payoff phase, we have created 4 ATP molecules, but we have to pay back the 2 ATP that we invested in the first phase. So our overall net gain, and again, this is a classic exam question, our overall net gain, so glycolysis provides an overall net gain of 2 ATP. And that's where we get that from, because we can't say there's 4 of those 4 produced, we have to pay back the 2 that we originally had. So glycolysis, only that part of cellular respiration provides, creates 2 ATP. Okay, so the understanding what the investment phase is and the payoff phase. But also what's happening is this intermediate compound is getting further broken down into now our pyruvate. Okay, and a pyruvate is a 3 carbon molecule. Okay, because essentially what's happening is, so remember, this glucose is made of carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. Okay, so what's going to happen is we're going to start removing these hydrogen atoms, and what's happening is these hydrogen atoms also has a certain level of energy attached to them. So we talk about hydrogen ions and their associated electrons, and we'll talk about electrons later on in the third stage. So our enzyme for our energy payoff phase that we're going to talk about is dehydrogenase. Okay, so I'm going to break this word down further for you. Okay, so D, we're talking about removing something. Hydrogen is obviously the thing we're removing. And remember, A is if you see that at the end, that's telling you that's an enzyme. Okay, so dehydrogenase is going to help remove the hydrogen ions and their electrons from this intermediate compound. Okay, and then another little enzyme, but we class it as a coenzyme because that's basically a compound that helps. So it's an enzyme that helps remove things. Okay, so NAD, okay, dehydrogenase removes the hydrogen ions and electrons and passes it on to NAD, this coenzyme that carries the hydrogen ions and electrons. Okay, so what happens is, as the dehydrogenase removes the hydrogen ions and electrons, it adds onto this molecule here that therefore creates this NADH. Okay, and what's going to happen is this NADH is going to travel all the way down to the electron transport chain. So carries hydrogen ions and electrons to the electron transport chain. Okay, so glucose is split into its intermediate compound, which is further split into pyruvate. Glycolysis has two phases: energy investment, as it invests 2 ATP, and energy payoff phase, which is the phase where they create 4 ATP, but they pay back the 2 ATP that was originally invested. So we've got a net gain of 2 ATP for glycolysis. And then during our energy payoff phase, dehydrogenase enzyme removes hydrogen ions and electrons, adds them onto this coenzyme NAD, which therefore carries the hydrogen ions all the way down to the third stage of cellular respiration, the electron transport chain. Okay, and the final point to make is that glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm. Cool.